Helter Skelter is arguably the most controversial Beatles song. Mostly due to a series of tragic events that had nothing to do with the band. But beyond that tragedy, the song has also been polarizing for its unusual style. Whether you love it or hate it, you might not be aware that Helter Skelter is loaded with wild anomalies, and even a mystery that fans still debate over 50 years later. I'm going to explore some of these anomalies in the context of the song's recording history. And as a fair warning, once I point them out, you can't unhear this. Helter Skelter appears on the latter half of the Beatles' monumental self-titled double album, better known as the White Album. Like many songs on the White Album, Helter Skelter is an exploration of a specific style, falling somewhere in between pastiche and parody. In this case, of a psychedelic hard rock freakout, with scorching performances, mixed with a cacophony of unexpected sounds, all assembled in a loose structure that eventually collapses into madness, climaxing with Ringo's famous resignation to the occupational hazards of a brutal recording session.
I got blisters on my fingers!
There's a lot more buried in the chaos too, which we'll get into later in the episode. Helter Skelter was written by Paul McCartney in early to mid-1968, during the creative explosion the band experienced following their extended trip to India. An early snippet of the song was serendipitously captured by a film crew that had stopped by EMI during Paul's recording session for Blackbird on June 11th.
Tell me the answer. Maybe I love her, but you ain't no dancer. Look out, Helter Skelter.
It wasn't until a month later, however, that the band attempted a recording. On July 18, 1968, in EMI Studio 2, the four Beatles worked for a bit on John's new song Cry Baby Cry,
Cry, baby, cry.
and then turned their attention to Paul's new composition, rehearsing and jamming until 3:30 the next morning. Among this session's recordings is a legendary 27-minute-long jam, a holy grail among some fans, that is reportedly the longest Beatles studio recording ever. It remains unreleased, even on bootlegs. A different, shorter take from that night, however, has been officially released on a few compilations over the years. Take 2 of Helter Skelter is quite different from the final version. Here the song is performed in a haunting minor key and features a slow, pulsating rhythm.
Don't you want me to love you?
And multiple meandering guitar solos. While there were some promising ideas here, it seemed that the band was still experimenting and hadn't settled on a satisfying direction yet. After the late-night July session, the band set the track aside, continuing to work on a slew of other songs that would eventually wind up on the White Album. Almost 2 months later, they finally returned to Helter Skelter on the 9th of September, assembling for a wild evening session at EMI. The band recorded a series of new takes with the help of engineer Ken Scott and producer Chris Thomas, 2 young, eager EMI personnel who had been assigned to cover for the band's usual producer George Martin while he was on holiday. Like a grade school class when a substitute teacher steps in, the Beatles took full advantage of Martin's absence during a session that was described by witnesses as total madness and hysterics. For instance, while Paul was recording his vocals, George Harrison was apparently parading around the studio with a flaming ashtray on his head, channeling the flamboyant psychedelic artist Arthur Brown. It turns out the under-supervised, chaotic atmosphere was just what the song needed. At some point between July and September, Paul decided that he wanted Helter Skelter to one-up contemporaries like The Who, Jimi Hendrix, Blue Cheer, Cream, and others that were pushing the boundaries of sonic mayhem in rock. As the inveterate creative sponges that the Beatles were, they absorbed these influences and wrung out a fresh interpretation that tried to push the boundaries even further. From the layers of distorted electric guitars to the scorching vocals.
Tell me, come on, tell me the answer!
To the aggressive bass. And Ringo's blistering percussion, literally. Pleased with this new direction, the band selected the final take from the September 9th session as a suitable backing track, and then spent the next day, September 10th, adding numerous finishing touches. Conveniently, EMI had recently set up, at the band's request, a new 8-track recorder, which they had used for the very first time a few days earlier on George's new song, While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
I look at you all.
For Helter Skelter, the new machine allowed the band to easily add more vocal harmonies. More guitar parts. A brief piano part. And even trumpet and saxophone, played quite unconventionally by John Lennon and Beatles roadie Mal Evans. But that's not all. If you listen very closely, you may detect a bunch of other bizarre spoken snippets throughout the track. Some of these lines are buried so deeply among the other sounds that it isn't clear what's being said, unless the tracks are isolated. Perhaps most bizarre is an entire bit of Paul's studio chatter left in.
Hey, come here, son. I'll show you do that, you little bugger. Put your bloody hands on your head. Come on.
All of these snippets simply add to the song's viscerally unsettling atmosphere.
Okay.
With all of these diverse pieces spread across 8 tracks, the recording was complete, but the weirdness continued even into the mixes. For a little context, the White Album would be the last Beatles album to get an official release in mono. The mono format had been fading in popularity by the late 1960s in favor of 2-channel stereo, which has remained the most commonly used format for recorded music since. Ironically, the White Album's mono and stereo mixes are some of the most divergent of their entire catalog, and Helter Skelter is probably the most noticeable example. The final mono version of Helter Skelter, which was mixed first on September 17th, has major differences from the later stereo mix, including more prominent harmony vocals, a different drum sound, but most of all, the mono mix is an entire minute shorter, fading out long before Ringo's famous exclamation. Therefore, it can only be heard on the stereo version. But within the performance itself, an even more interesting anomaly has sparked a heated debate among some fans. Who played the bass? As most fans know, Paul McCartney played bass guitar on the vast majority of Beatles songs, dating back to their earliest hits. But in the September 1968 issue of the Beatles Monthly Fan magazine, Beatles roadie, confidant, and casual archivist Mal Evans casually mentions an unnamed 24-minute right old jam session. He's referring to the slow July version of Helter Skelter. He notes that John Lennon played bass guitar just for a change. In the October 1968 issue, an entry references the nameless song again, reiterating John on bass, Paul using Epiphone guitar, and George on his new Gibson. Finally, in the November issue, which includes summaries of a bunch of new White Album songs, Helter Skelter is finally mentioned by name, with the final note that John plays bass, which is unusual. And it was unusual. Before the White Album sessions, there aren't any confirmed instances of John playing the final bass part on any Beatles song. And, as Ringo put it,
John was not going to play bass.
Following Mal's account, most sources, including the official White Album Deluxe Edition booklet, and even the Beatles Rock Band video game, assume Paul and George on guitar and John on the Fender 6 bass, a unique 6-string instrument with a distinctive tone, used occasionally during the White Album sessions and later on during the Get Back sessions by John or George, typically while Paul was on another instrument. In 2018, however, a new piece of evidence surfaced that has led some fans to argue that this might be incorrect. On Disc 5 of the White Album Deluxe Edition, an outtake of Helter Skelter was released that allegedly proves that Paul, not John, is playing bass on the final version. The debate springs out of take 17,
Helter Skelter, take 17.
recorded on September 9th, shortly before the final take that was chosen for the song, take 21. Since this is a live take, and we can hear 2 electric guitars and a bass guitar, That means that John, Paul, and George were playing one instrument each. Let's listen to the chatter before take 17 begins.
Have extra on the first one, sorry.
According to the new Paul theory, he's demonstrating how he wants extra emphasis on the first beat of that opening riff. To help explain it, he's demonstrating using his bass guitar. Next, Paul gives another instruction, again using the bass to help explain his point.
Even though I may not be singing it moving along, I'm just trying to maybe get to the bottom and then just imagine it.
Later on, it sounds like Paul is asking the EMI engineers to end the song creatively with a tape rewinding sound, instead of a normal fade-out.
At the end, if it's gone well at the end, do that winding back the tape thing.
He then demonstrates the timing on bass.
Because I just sort of end up on Helter Skelter, Helter Skelter, yeah, Helter Skelter.
These snippets of dialogue, when taken together with the performance that immediately follows, have fueled a debate across message boards, YouTube comments, and Reddit posts. Fans have even dug up further evidence, such as Ringo describing Helter Skelter as a track we did in total madness and hysterics in the studio. Sometimes you had to shake out the jams. And with that song, Paul's bass line and my drums, Paul started screaming and shouting and made it up on the spot. As far as I'm aware, there aren't any documented photographs from this specific session, and neither Paul nor John, George, Ken Scott, or Chris Thomas have ever commented about the bass part here in the decades of interviews since. So Ringo's kind of vague later recollection, Mal's newsletter notes, and the audio are all we have. So who's right? There are a few aspects of the actual recording to review for clues. First, the sound of the bass itself. The John argument claims that Helter Skelter's bass sounds like the distinctive tone of the Fender 6, often described as being in between a normal bass and a regular guitar. But here's the Fender 6 on another White Album track, Honey Pie, as played by George while Paul was on piano. To my ears, it's not the same sound as on Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter's bass sound does closely resemble a few other songs in the Beatles catalog, all of which were recorded around the same time, and all of which were documented as being played by Paul. Year Blues, recorded a month earlier. Why Don't We Do It in the Road, a month later.
Why don't we do it in the road?
Or Glass Onion, recorded the very next day after Helter Skelter. Why does this bass sound so different from earlier Beatles songs? Well, around this time, Paul had acquired a new Fender Jazz bass guitar, and he was clearly enamored with its meaty sound, hence its regular appearance on the White Album, including possibly two here on Helter Skelter. Next, let's turn to the performance. The John on bass theory claims that Helter Skelter's bass part is too aggressive and too sloppy to have been played by Paul, normally a quite meticulous bass player. Then again, Paul's goal here was to record
the dirtiest, the loudest, the most out of control, the great, wackiest thing we've ever done.
So the style fits. Furthermore, during the middle bridge section on take 17, it sounds like Paul is basically singing along to the bass part. Considering this sounds like a spontaneous ad-lib on a live take, it seems very likely that's him singing and playing. What about the other guitars on the backing track? If Paul were on bass guitar, as the new theory suggests, then that means that John and George were handling their usual roles on guitar. And I find this lineup plausible. After all, the distorted opening riff sounds strikingly similar to John's opening riff on the single version of Revolution, released just weeks earlier. We also learned from take 17 that the rest of the guitar parts on the backing track are only playing basic chords throughout. The only instrument that plays the famous descending scale at this point is the bass guitar. In my view, it seems unlikely that Paul would give such a critical part of his own song to someone else to play, especially John, who really didn't like to play bass. Beyond Take 17, another intriguing piece of auditory evidence from that day surfaced on the 2018 White Album Deluxe Edition. In between takes, the band jumped into an ad-libbed run-through of the Elvis classic, You're So Square, Baby I Don't Care. To my ears, this spontaneous yet very tight jam sounds like the work of a confident bass player like Paul and a confident rhythm guitarist like John or George. Because the band basically rolls into Helter Skelter, we can assume it's the same instrument lineup on both songs. Clearly, there's a lot of intriguing clues in the tape archives that point to a fairly convincing case for Paul on bass. But what about Mal's account, the original source of this long-standing bass credit to John? Mal, who was ever present at Beatles sessions, was likely correct about John playing the very simple bass part on the slow July rehearsal session, while Paul was still working out the direction for the song. As for the September session, perhaps Mal or the newsletter editor just mixed it up. I contacted Kenneth Womack, author of a fantastic new Mal Evans biography, Living the Beatles Legend. He reviewed Mal's diaries for these session dates and confirmed that Mal only mentions the Helter Skelter instrument lineup, with John on bass, in a diary entry from July. Mal's diary also mentions the September remake, but there's no mention of the lineup and no mention of John on bass. So those later newsletter reports might simply have repeated the July details by mistake. With dozens of new songs to report on and limited ways to corroborate details, a minor oversight like that could easily go unnoticed and eventually seep into the official narrative. That is, until recently. As with a lot of these debates, the most intriguing aspect to me isn't the answer, but rather that there could even be a question in the first place. These organic little anomalies of the analog era, especially during this period of wild studio experimentation, are part of why the Beatles' catalog remains so endearing, so fascinating, and so alive all these decades later. As a song, Helter Skelter is a fitting reflection of the band's creative state during this period, unrestrained, unflinching, and defying all expectations. Coming off the roller coaster experience of 1967 and their subsequent jaunt in India in early 1968, the Beatles as a cohesive creative unit was fracturing, and ideas that might not have passed muster under the former Lennon-McCartney regime were suddenly let loose. Much like the sprawling, diverse, and polarizing album on which it appears, Helter Skelter must have seemed startling in 1968, and that was intentional. As the loudest and raunchiest song they had released up to that point, Helter Skelter repudiated expectations of what a Beatles song should sound like, especially one written by Paul McCartney, who had developed a reputation for being the clean-cut, pop-oriented songwriter of the group. In reality, Paul had consistently pushed the others to embrace the avant-garde, and had been the impetus behind some of their most daring works to date. Helter Skelter, though, was perhaps the first time that this side of Paul was so prominently on display.
Helter Skelter! She's coming out fast!
Funnily enough, one early reviewer of the White Album even mistook Helter Skelter as a John Lennon composition, calling it exhaustingly marvelous and a brilliant feat of invention. Even today, opinions of Helter Skelter are mixed. Some fans consider it overindulgent, tedious, and even irritating, while others adore it for its hypnotic power and capturing a moment when the full band seemed to be having a great time together. I think everyone can agree, though, that it marks a fascinating waypoint in their long and winding road from Love Me Do, barely 6 years earlier. As with many pivotal moments during their career, the Beatles were both absorbing and contributing to emerging sounds. In this case, heavy, psychedelic-tinged hard rock, moments ahead of a mainstream explosion from megagroups like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. Speaking of Led Zeppelin, there's a fantastic fan-created mashup of Helter Skelter with Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love.
When I get to the bottom, I go back to the top of the slide.
Definitely worth checking out. Sadly, soon after its release, Helter Skelter would be negatively linked to a horrific tragedy involving Charles Manson and his cult of followers, who claimed to have heard encoded messages in songs on the White Album, including Helter Skelter. which also became the title of the best-selling book recounting the saga. Despite having nothing to do with the Beatles themselves, the unfortunate association of the song with the Manson murders made Helter Skelter more notorious than notable. And the original meaning of the song's title, a reference to a type of slide in British amusement parks mirroring the descending main riff, has been almost entirely obscured along the way. Eventually, the song's virtues began to overshadow the Manson stigma and have allowed for a much-deserved reappraisal. Further help has come from the numerous covers of Helter Skelter released over the years by artists including Pat Benatar, Susie and the Banshees, Motley Crue, Oasis, Aerosmith, and U2.
Charles Manson stole from the Beatles. We're stealing it back.
After an understandable absence, the song has even made its way onto Paul McCartney's set lists on recent tours, where, by the way, he always plays the bass part. So what do you think about Helter Skelter? Let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and as always, thanks for listening and for subscribing.